For this week, I began exploring how the concepts of electricity, such as Maestri and the electronic monument, could apply to fields outside of English, in which electricity was first conceived. Essentially, electricity is being electronically literate and incorporating the knowledge and invention available through digital media into learning. However, how does it apply to learning in other disciplines? In order to think about this concept further, I turn to my own field of study, communication studies. Communication studies is a field that studies the phenomena of human communication in all of its forms. Electricity is a form of learning and invention, all of which conveys a message or communicates. Even if the communication is rather interpersonal, electricity still allows for communication of knowledge. Within communication studies, there are many theories, concepts, processes, etc. Each of these theories or concepts was developed or invented by scholars. They cover a wide range of topics and communication contexts. Communication can be anything from interpersonal face-to-face interaction to mass media. Essentially, overall, as a field, communication studies is rather flexible and allows for the study of almost any interaction. One can obviously see the connection between the field of study and the style of learning. Communication studies allows for scholars to view things such as the political, cultural, social, economic, semiotic, etc., dimensions of messages and communication phenomena. Although electricity and its related pedagogy does not have to relate to these same dimensions, inventive learning can include insights into those contexts, all depending on the individual. Electricity is focused on the individual invention of learning that relates and is focused on one person's life and the development of their personal knowledge. Since it is so individualized, it does seem that the communication with others is extraneous and potentially unneeded. For example, what Cecilia Jones's Maestri communicates to others is not important, only her individual growth and learning is. However, despite that the message is not the most important aspect of a Maestri, it still has a message. For example, I may not have experienced anything similar to Cecilia, but I can still glean some of her emotions and relate to her story through her expression. It tells her story, and while originally intended for her and for a mourning process, it connects with others and communicates about Cecilia in that moment. When trying to discuss Maestri and the creation and distribution of knowledge, I began to understand Ulmer's theory of conduction as a way in which knowledge, or the obtuse third meaning, is a form of communication. The knowledge and invention that belongs to one person is spread through something that resembles heat conduction. The meaning and connotation that one person feels can be partially transferred to another person. An example of this conduction is Cecilia's Maestri. Although she developed it for herself in her own learning, the impact of the finished product can be seen on others. Each one of us in the class connected with certain things in her story. In my case, I recognized her small town that is so interconnected as a reflection of my own hometown. Although my family has been more transient than Cecilia's, I can relate to that aspect of her life. I'm sure that everyone else in here had some moment of understanding or connection with Cecilia's Maestri. This goes back to the idea that knowledge is conducted between people, that other stories affect people in different ways. No one person is an island, stories, people, etc. all affects one another. Knowledge is conducted between people and between ideas. And although it may not always be intentional, it is a form of communication. In my opinion, all communication is personal. Therefore, I think that the personal individual focus of electricity makes sense in a communication context. It is the outward expression and creation of knowledge that is a personal interpretation of a concept or a context. From there, anyone else can apply their own experiences and lives to the knowledge and interpret it in their own personal way. Overall, despite the fact that it seems difficult to relate something so personal as electorate learning to a field that is often seen as the study of mass media, I see electricity as a method to facilitate a communication for the 21st century. If literacy has evolved to electricity, then why can't communication transition along with it? Overall, I think that a lot of the tenets of electricity and the institutions it advocates are relatable within communication. However, after reading parts of Ulmer's book, Electronic Monuments, I think memorials are probably one of the easiest concepts from electricity to relate to communication studies. I associate memorials with grieving or reverence, which almost any person can relate to. Despite that not all people communicate in the same way, I think that everyone experiences some form of grief. Although Ulmer gets into greater detail about the ideas behind a memorial, I took away from the chapters of Electronic Monuments that since we are now living in an electorate world where there is an increased focus on digital communication, that we should be able to express anything in an electorate manner, even grief and remembrance. Memorials should not need to exist physically, but can be electronic and still hold social significance. While reading through Electronic Monuments, I kept thinking that there are so many examples of times in the history of the United States that could be memorialized. Ulmer made references to two major monuments related to that history. The first is Mount Rushmore, and the second is the electronic memorials to the Twin Towers. In my opinion, these are two great examples that show the difference between a physical and an electronic memorial. Although Mount Rushmore is iconic, Ulmer explains that iconicism is not necessary anymore for monuments or memorials. Instead, he kept talking about September 11th and its impact on people and their reactions through things like online forums, websites, creating imagery, all to help grieve the loss, to help with recovery, and to help with remembrance. Reading all these passages about devastating events and their impacts on a national level made me think of other incidences that may have affected many Americans recently. Incidences that have inspired both physical and electronic memorials are things such as the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School and the devastation that was caused by Hurricane Sandy. After researching further into the digital memorials and the impact of these two events, I began thinking of my own life and the things that I have created an electronic monument for. One specific event comes to mind. When I was a junior in high school, a tornado destroyed the school and 8 students were killed. Now every year on March 1st, the students reflect back and remember. Although a physical monument was eventually erected in memoriam to those who died that day, there has always been a trend for us students to create collages, post statuses, and spread messages about our grief on Facebook. We've memorialized that devastating incident through digital means, and despite that there's a permanent physical structure now, these electronic monuments are just as lasting and helpful. Everyone grieves in his or her own way. It is just another form of personal communication, something that may not have an intention for others to interpret, but can affect others just the same. Electronic monuments and expressing grief digitally are just the progression of all aspects of life toward electricity. Life is expressed and created digitally as well as physically now. Overall, many different types of communication can be seen within electricity. Although this new form of learning is more focused on the individual, communication still occurs through the invention of knowledge and its conduction. In addition, the methods of knowledge creation and expression, such as mastery and electronic monuments, allows for people to communicate their knowledge and emotions most easily or most notably that of grief.